On the 17th of December 2000, Eleanor Vance and Julian Croft sat side by side at a press conference. After 29 years of marriage, the couple that had defined an era in Hollywood announced their divorce. Julian explained the reason: to care for his aging mother. But a few days later, a shockwave hit the entertainment world. Julian Croft had married a woman 22 years his junior. The divorce had been finalized just 5 days earlier. Eleanor was on location in Chicago when she received the news by phone. Normally, a person would be consumed by rage. The man she had spent nearly 3 decades with had married another woman in less than a week. But Eleanor is said to have replied, "Good for you. When I'm back in New York, the three of us should have dinner." Why wasn't she angry? Why didn't she resent her ex-husband? To understand the answer, one must go back to their beginning. It was around 1970. Their mutual friend, the actress Serafina Monet, said to Eleanor, "Ellie, Julian Croft is a huge fan of yours. You should let him take you out." But Eleanor's reply was surprising. "Thanks, but he's not my type." The man she dismissed as not my type. With a single sentence, that same man would eventually win her heart. What was that sentence? The person who introduced Eleanor Vance and Julian Croft was unexpected: the actress Serafina Monet. At the time, Serafina and Julian had a history of their own. Around 1966, the two co-starred in a Broadway play, Thieves' Carnival, and began a relationship. It was said that Julian would bring a single rose to Serafina's dressing room every day. They soon began living together. However, Serafina later reflected on that time, saying he was the kind of man who would bring a rose every day. To her, Julian was less a passionate lover and more of a polite, well-mannered young man. She found him a bit preachy, and their relationship eventually fizzled out. A few years later, Serafina introduced her former live-in boyfriend to another woman. Serafina herself has never spoken about why she did it. Perhaps it was simply the casual, interconnected nature of their world at the time. One thing is certain: Serafina and Eleanor were true best friends. Years later, Serafina would say of Eleanor, "You can't let that woman walk through life alone." This reveals a deep friendship, not just a professional acquaintance. Despite the introduction, Eleanor showed no interest in Julian. She later recalled, "I just wasn't very attracted to Julian, so I kept saying, 'Thank you, but he's not my type.'" So, what was Eleanor's type? When asked about her ideal man, she would instantly reply, "Jack Garrett." Eleanor and Garrett had co-starred in dozens of films. However, she also said he was like a brother. Garrett had married actress Ann Miller in 1960 and was not a romantic prospect for Eleanor, but rather an idealized figure on the silver screen. Eleanor's true affections had been directed elsewhere. At 83, Eleanor confessed on a talk show that in her 20s, there was a major actor she had wanted to marry, Vince Gallo. But that love was not to be. As she entered her 30s, Eleanor began to think, maybe it's time to get married. Eleanor Vance and Julian Croft came from completely different worlds. Eleanor was born in South Boston, living in a cramped apartment after the war. She became an actress at 14, making her name in the world of gritty B-movie westerns. In contrast, Julian was a quintessential New York City boy, born on Park Avenue and raised in a Connecticut suburb. He attended Yale for both his undergraduate and drama degrees and belonged to the refined world of Broadway theater. Eleanor later said of her first impression, "He was such an intellectual. I was sure he was the type who would never hit on me." But her prediction would be wrong. In January 1971, fate intervened. They were cast as husband and wife in the NBC drama 23rd Street. The shoot lasted for 6 months. Eleanor recalled that period. "Working with Julian on the drama for half a year, he gradually started to win me over." As filming progressed, Eleanor's impression of him slowly changed. "Once I got to know him, I realized he knew so much about everything. For me, having become an actress at 14 and knowing so little of the world, he was like a teacher who taught me so many things. The man who was not my type had become like a teacher." How did this change happen? It was a single sentence from this intellectual man that would move her heart and begin a 29-year story. Julian Croft actively pursued Eleanor. On set, he was always by her side, constantly engaging her in conversation. Eleanor, in turn, began to make a move of her own. She started bringing homemade lunches to the set. Julian later joked, "She completely captured me by my stomach." He pursued with words, and she responded with food. They slowly closed the distance between them. Then one day, Julian said to her, You are an actress. Even if we get married, you must choose your roles and continue to be an actress." That sentence sealed her decision. In the 1970s, it was far from a given that an actress would continue her career after marriage. The prevailing value was that a woman's place was in the home. Amidst that culture, Julian told her he wanted her to keep working. For Eleanor, who had lived as an actress since she was 14, these words held a special meaning. Her career was her life. Julian, accompanied by the renowned screenwriter David Shapiro, visited Eleanor's family home to formally propose. Shapiro was the writer of 23rd Street and had been instrumental in their meeting. The veteran actress Helen Hayes, who was like a mother figure in the industry, also counseled them. She reportedly told Eleanor, "Ellie, if you're happy, then it's the right thing to do." Eleanor's father, a former Marine, had once fiercely opposed his daughter's wish to marry Vince Gallo, shouting, "I won't give my daughter to some punk I know nothing about." But Julian was different. A Yale graduate from a wealthy background, there was no reason for her father to object. Interestingly, the screenwriter David Shapiro was present for the proposal. He wrote the script that brought them together and was there to witness their engagement. 46 years later, the same David Shapiro would write Serenity Hills, a series that would reunite the three of them. Eleanor made up her mind. She decided she would follow this man for the rest of her life. On the 11th of March, 1971, the couple appeared on The Tonight Show to announce their engagement. Julian told the host, "I was just so in love with her, I couldn't help myself." The broadcast earned a record-breaking viewership share. They filed for a marriage license on April 9th, rushing it so they could get passports for their honeymoon. And on May 14th, they were married at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. The ceremony was at 3 p.m., followed by a reception at the Plaza Hotel at 5 p.m. Then, at 7:45 p.m., they appeared live again on The Tonight Show, a whirlwind schedule. The best man and maid of honor were Jack Garrett and his wife, and the acclaimed novelist Truman Capote and his partner. Garrett, who was like an older brother to Eleanor after dozens of films together, stood by them. The reception was swarmed by over 100 photographers and nearly 200 reporters. The entire nation was captivated by the birth of Hollywood's new power couple. The next day, they flew to Europe for a nearly 2-month honeymoon. Upon hearing of their marriage, Vince Gallo reportedly said, "I bet you it won't last 2 years, but they would remain husband and wife not for 2 years, but for 29. Those 29 years were anything but a smooth path. Just 5 years in, Eleanor would have a startling realization. In the beginning, Eleanor lived a life befitting a newlywed. She later recalled, "In the early days, I did all sorts of wifely things. I'd lay out his socks, pick out his tie, get his suit ready." The heroine of gritty westerns was helping her husband get dressed every morning. Such was their newlywed life. However, Eleanor's work schedule became increasingly demanding. "I would often leave the house earlier than him and come home later." Julian told her, "Don't worry about me anymore, just work freely." Eleanor later said, "I'm so grateful for that. It was a truly happy thing. It's rare to find someone so understanding, isn't it? He never once said, 'Be more of a wife,' or 'You should stay home.'" Julian taught Eleanor about painting, and she eventually became skilled enough to have her work shown in galleries. He taught her about constellations, about cooking, and about the immense difficulty of balancing a career as an actress with a family life. The teacher figure remained even after marriage, but a distance gradually grew between them. Eleanor said she sensed her husband's infidelity on several occasions. Then, about 5 or 6 years into their marriage, Julian said, "I want to get a studio for my painting hobby." Eleanor described the moment she heard those words. "It just hit me. Ah, so that's what this is." And sure enough, there was another woman. The studio was not a place for painting, but a place to spend time with someone else. Eleanor felt anger. She considered leaving him, but eventually she came to think, "I'll just let it be until the passion cools." You can't control a person's feelings. In the 1970s, divorce was a scandal for an actress. Eleanor was playing the recurring beloved character of Lily in the popular A Drifter's Journey film series, appearing 4 times the most of any guest star. She was the Madonna of Madonnas. At the peak of her career, divorce may not have seemed like an option. Eleanor thought she would wait until his passion faded, but this separation would last for 18 years. Around 1982, they officially began living apart. Julian moved into another apartment, while Eleanor remained in their home. The tabloids ran headlines asking divorce this year, almost annually. The count reportedly exceeded 30 times. They were sometimes mocked as a sham marriage. But a reporter who covered them for years stated, while they were derided as a sham couple, they respected each other's privacy. Their relationship was, in its own way, quite good. Eleanor continued to immerse herself in her work as an actress. And, astonishingly, it's said that Eleanor would sometimes visit her husband's apartment to clean it, knowing that another woman was living there with him. Eleanor explained, I would go over to clean sometimes, but, you don't want to get in the way of things. How could she do such a thing? Eleanor described her own personality. I'm the type who can see things from a distance without getting emotional. That's why we were able to part so cleanly. Meanwhile, Julian was also undergoing a change. Around 1997, he had a conversation with his 90-year-old father that deeply affected him. He realized with urgency that his time to be a dutiful son was limited. Around this time, a female staff member from his theater company, Catherine, began helping to care for Julian's parents. Julian later said of their relationship, she and I nurtured a love for 4 years. In June 2000, Julian's father passed away. His mother's legs had weakened, and she could no longer cook for herself. Julian made a decision. He would move his mother in with him. To do that, he felt he needed a new family. Recall the promise he made at the beginning of their marriage. In 1971, Julian had told Eleanor, we don't need children, and you should continue your career. But in 2000, Julian told Eleanor, I want to be with someone who will always be at home, and I want children. I also want to move my mother in with us. 29 years earlier, he didn't want children. Now he did. Eleanor was 60 years old at this time, past the age of childbearing. His words were, in effect, a request for a divorce. Why hadn't Eleanor Vance agreed to a divorce until this moment? And what happened next would shake the foundations of Hollywood. In 2000, Julian Croft asked Eleanor for a divorce. She later recounted, at first I was surprised and shaken, but then I thought, I see, he has someone else. So, in the end, I said, I understand, surprised, shaken. But she didn't beg or cry, she didn't try to hold him back. Eleanor simply said, I understand. She made only one request. I want us to hold a press conference together. 3 days later, on the 17th of December 2000, they sat side by side for the press. Julian explained the reason for the divorce. To care for my aging mother. I cannot drag the actress Eleanor Vance into that. A reporter asked if there was another woman involved. Julian raised his voice and retorted, if there had been an affair, this would have been settled much sooner. However, he also added, I am thinking about starting a family. I'm almost 60, so the sooner the better. Among the press corps, some were heard to murmur, I didn't even know they were still married. Having lived apart for 18 years, many assumed they had divorced long ago. Eleanor later said, when the topic of divorce came up, I thought, why now? Why now? They had lived separately and freely for 18 years. Why the need for a formal divorce at this point? A journalist analyzed it this way. That's why Eleanor's why now was her genuine, unvarnished feeling. Even we, who had covered them for years, thought, why now? But in the end, Eleanor accepted the divorce. Why hadn't she for 29 years? She spoke of her personality. I've always had a very stoic, almost masculine personality. I endure things, and no matter how painful it is, I don't voice it. She continued, thankfully that personality was very useful for my job as an actress. Enduring, not voicing pain. These were necessary qualities for an actress. But they were also qualities that manifested in her marriage. Julian's real reason was not his mother's care, but his desire to live with a woman who would be at home. In 1971, Julian told Eleanor, you are an actress. Continue to be an actress. But in 2000, what Julian wanted was someone who would always be at home. Being an actress was the very reason he had loved her. But being an actress also became the reason he left her. There is an interesting footnote. Julian cited his mother's care, but immediately after the divorce, he accepted the lead role in the historical television series, The Governor, which filmed in Santa Fe and would require him to be away from home for nearly 6 months. If caring for his mother was truly the priority, why would he take a long-term job out of state? The divorce was filed on December 27th. Just 5 days later, Julian Croft married his new wife. On the 1st of January 2001, Julian Croft married Catherine. She was 37 years old, 22 years his junior. Just 5 days after the divorce, The news sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. While legally sound, what were the moral implications? On January 17th, Julian held a press conference in Santa Fe. I felt it was best to get married as soon as possible, he explained. Catherine had been a staff member at Julian's theater company. For 4 years, she had helped care for his parents, building a family-like relationship. Julian himself admitted they had nurtured a love for 4 years. When asked about his mother at the press conference, Julian's eyes welled with tears. My mother is so happy. I'm glad I could do this while she's still with us. When asked about children, he replied, I might look young, but I'm nearly 60. Wanting children was one of the reasons for the divorce. In the end, however, Julian and Catherine never had children. To this day, they remain childless. Eleanor was on location in Chicago when she heard the news by phone. In public statements, Eleanor said, whatever Julian does is no longer any of my concern, and I have nothing to say. It sounds like a cold remark. However, according to Julian on the phone, Eleanor said, good for you. When I'm back in New York, the 3 of us should have dinner. The public reaction and the private one, which was the real Eleanor? Perhaps both were. Years later, Eleanor reflected on the divorce. Did I cry? Of course. Well, maybe I didn't cry that much. He's not the kind of person who makes you cry. There's a certain sweetness to Jules. Jules. It was his nickname, from his stage name back on Broadway. Even after the divorce, Eleanor continued to call her ex-husband by that name. Eleanor Vance has said, I am very grateful to Julian. If he hadn't asked for a divorce, we might still be together today. To understand the true meaning of these words, one must know what happened next. What kind of life did Eleanor Vance lead after? And her reunion with her ex-husband would come in a most unexpected way. Eleanor Vance had a younger actress whom she loved like a sister, Clara Dunn. Their friendship began in the mid-1970s when they co-starred in a TV drama. Eleanor later said it had been about 33 years. Clara once said to Eleanor, make me part of your family, make me your youngest sister. And Clara truly became like a member of Eleanor's family. She spent Christmas at Eleanor's home, attended firework displays with them, and was at Eleanor's nephew's wedding. When Eleanor's father was on his deathbed, Clara sat by his side, stroking his face and saying, Dad, Dad. Clara was there for the final moments of Eleanor's parents and her sister. Though not related by blood, Clara was the youngest child of the Vance family. But in her later years, Clara suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome and became emotionally unstable. She would make frantic calls late at night. Eleanor tried her best to support her, but eventually the two grew distant. In 2009, Clara Dunn died alone in her home. She was 62. At the funeral, Eleanor read the eulogy. Even when you pushed me away, I should have been the big sister who held on to you. I should have just been there to gently rub your back. I am so sorry, Clara. I am so sorry. To Julian, she said, good for you, without a word of resentment. But to Clara, she said, I'm sorry, and blamed herself. She did not resent Julian. She regretted her actions with Clara. To not blame others, but to look inward, perhaps. That is the essence of Eleanor Vance. Then, in 2017, an unexpected reunion occurred. The screenwriter David Shapiro wrote the acclaimed TV series Serenity Hills. Shapiro was the same writer who penned 23rd Street, the show that had brought Eleanor and Julian together in 1971. 46 years later, he wrote a drama that would have them co-star once again. And Serafina Monet was also cast. The same Serafina who had once lived with Julian and then introduced him to Eleanor. The 3 of them were together in the same drama. Before filming began, Eleanor said, I especially couldn't wait to see Julian. It was a reunion after 16 years. In their first scene together, Eleanor held Julian in a long embrace. It's been 16 years. All of those feelings were in that hug. It was wonderful. Serafina, watching them, quipped, that was for the scene, right? Eleanor laughed and replied, yes, for the scene. On the last day of filming, Eleanor and Serafina, both wearing wedding dresses for a scene, stood on either side of Julian for a photo. Eleanor chose a lace dress similar to the one she had worn at her own wedding. Serafina remarked, I never want to wear a wedding dress again. They're not for wearing, they're for looking at. The 3 of them had walked their own paths. Eleanor was with Julian for 29 years. Serafina lived with him. Then they drifted apart. Julian, after Eleanor, remarried Catherine. But 46 years later, they stood together in the same place. Eleanor has said that when she was young, She never even considered having children. I couldn't imagine myself as a mother. That's how completely I was absorbed in my work as an actress. But in 2021, at the age of 81, Eleanor said on a television program, her voice trembling, "I wish I had a child, even if I had to raise them by myself. That is my one and only regret." She had lived as an actress since she was 14. She married a man who acknowledged her for being an actress. But in the end, being an actress left her alone. Of her 29 years with Julian, Eleanor has said, "My life with Julian was nothing but gains. I lost nothing at all. I lost nothing at all." Is that really true? No, she knows. She knows there was something lost. But she does not blame anyone. She accepts it as her own choice. That, perhaps, is the way Eleanor Vance has lived her life. As of today, Eleanor Vance is 85 years old. Julian Croft is 84, and Serafina Monet is 82. All three have no children. They have walked different paths, but the result is the same. Eleanor lives alone. Julian lives with Catherine. Serafina lives with her long-term partner, unmarried. She spent 29 years with a man she once dismissed as not my type. She endured the humiliation of his remarriage 5 days after their divorce without a word of resentment. While holding the regret of not having a child, she insists that she lost nothing at all. She does not resent. She simply accepts her choices. That was the way of the actress, Eleanor Vance.